Next, we have Christine Jolls from Yale Law School.
Like everyone else, I regard it as a complete privilege to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. This panel has two topics, as you know from the program, the conditions for living well and the question of free will. My comments will focus on the first aspect of that, so in contrast to the comments so far, in terms of the book, my comments are more about Chapter 9 than Chapter 10. Living well for Dworkin obviously will diverge from a kind of simple-minded economist conception of living well, doing or having the things that happen to please me right now. That much I think is obvious. At the same time, if we were to engage in a detailed project, and I'll describe such a project in a moment, of asking people about their feelings of pleasure and displeasure, of satisfaction and frustration, we presumably would think that living well would not be completely and entirely unrelated to people's responses to those questions. I will quote Dworkin, a beautiful passage that is evocative of this, although in the paper I offer a couple of arguments in addition. But he writes, in describing the notion of living well or displaying an art in living, he says, when you do something smaller well, play a tune or a part or a hand, throw a curve or a compliment, make a chair or a sonnet or love, your satisfaction is complete in itself. It needs no bush and it needs no sequel. Those are achievements within life. Why can't a life also be an achievement complete in itself, with its own value for the art in living it displays? That passage both foreshadows a distinction I'm going to be emphasizing and makes at least some reference to the concept of one's own satisfaction with an experience. So what I'd like to do is try to, as I mentioned, flesh out this economist's notion of people's experiences and then use that to surface and explore a really interesting distinction that Dworkin makes in talking about living well. To start with Dworkin, one of the pieces of his architecture for living well is a distinction he makes by analogizing to art. And this is the distinction between the product of something we do and the actual performance of creation. So he says, we value great art most fundamentally, not because the art as product enhances our lives, but because it embodies a performance, a rising to artistic challenge. We value human lives as these are lived, not for the completed narrative, as if fiction would do as well, but because they too embody a performance, rising to the challenge of having a life to lead. This passage was incredibly striking to me because the single clearest insight or complication to emerge from the economics literature on what gives people satisfaction as an empirical matter is the incredible divergence between the answers you get if you ask people for what produces a satisfying completed narrative and if you ask people what they actually feel about the performance of life's tasks. And I was very interested to put this into conversation with Dworkin's passage. Let me tell you a little bit about the economists' different measures. And I'm saying economists, it's actually economists and psychologists working together. And I'll mostly be talking about what I call the Princeton group. Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist, although a Nobel laureate in economics, Alan Kruger, and a couple of their co-authors. Before their work, the way that economists thought about people's satisfaction with their lives was to ask questions like those in the World Values Survey or the General Social Survey. Things like, all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Or taken all together, how would you say things are these days? Would you say you are very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? And we have data on these sorts of questions for whatever they're worth from many countries over many time periods. Many people have for long thought that these questions aren't that informative, and what Kahneman and Kruger and others decided to do was to be much more constructive in the data gathering task. They pioneered a method they call the day reconstruction method, and here's how it works. They have people first revive detailed memories of their previous day by listing what they did throughout the day, and then describe each episode. The subjects are to describe each episode by answering questions about the situation and the feelings they experienced. They're given pairs such as happy, warm, friendly, enjoying myself, frustrated, annoyed, depressed, blue, hassled, pushed around, and so forth. And not surprisingly, things like socializing, relaxing, and quote, intimate relations are positive for people in this method, and commuting, working, and housework are kind of at the bottom of the list. Now, what struck me was that both the distinction between the product of life and the performance of life's tasks, and the distinction between questions about your overall life satisfaction and questions about your day-to-day experience seemed like they might be in part about genuineness. So if we return to Dworkin's passage, we value human lives as these are lived not for the completed narrative, as if fiction would do as well, but because they too embody a performance rising to the challenge of having a life to lead. I want to emphasize this aspect about fiction versus genuineness and provide some context on that from the economics work. In broad terms, what I want to suggest is that the narrative storyline questions about overall satisfaction lead people to give answers that are kind of about the way they want to construct their lives. And by contrast, the questions about the actual experience of life's activities are kind of a more direct and less unmediated way of getting at people's experiences, and therefore are more genuine. To quote Aristotle, the pleasures involved in activities are more proper to them than the desires, for the latter are separated both in time and in nature, while the former are close to the activities. So I want to give an opening example and then a couple of further examples where I'll actually try to give some data if there's time left. But just as an opening example that gives the basic idea here, one thing that would be unsurprising is that when people are asked about their overall life satisfaction, they tend to think about their kind of prestige and material success. And one particular example of this that's been discussed in the literature is people think about their home. And there's a lovely quote by George Lowenstein, a behavioral economist, who knows that any measure of your actual genuine experience day to day shows that a long commute makes you miserable. Being isolated in a big leafy suburb that's less social makes you unhappy. And yet Lowenstein says, we all yearn for the roomy, isolated home, when in fact it will compromise our happiness by distancing us from neighbors. The big isolated home is exactly what I bought. I fell into a trap I never should have fallen into. So that's the general point, that people may think in these storyline terms that don't capture their genuine experience. Let me use my last couple of minutes to give you a little more specific data on these points. The gap between the storyline or product of life, if the analogy I'm offering is at all congenial to you, and the performance of life's activities or the actual experiences people have. One of the biggest topics in the economics literature on satisfaction is the role of income. To a very substantial degree, when our income rises, we adapt to the higher income and we don't appreciably increase our satisfaction. So these results are often sort of pointed to as the empirical counterpart to Robert F. Kennedy's famous suggestion that looking at something like the GNP means failing to capture the joy of our children's play, the strength of our marriages, our wit, our courage, our wisdom, our learning, our compassion, in short, everything that makes life worthwhile. What is striking is that the day-to-day measures, and House anecdote already indicated this, are even less related to our income. And if you crank through the data, and one thing that's amazing from this Princeton project is that all of the data is the huge data sets publicly available on the web for anyone to use. And the basic finding is that although even general questions about our lives are not very correlated with our income, our day-to-day experiences are basically completely uncorrelated with our income. And in some ways, that's not surprising. If you're commuting or whatever, it doesn't matter so much how much money you earn. Numerically, the correlation is 0.2 between the general narrative questions and income, and only about 0.05 for the day-to-day measures correlated with income. Let me take just one last minute to briefly mention one other example, which is sociability. Here, the effect is the opposite. Sociability has very little effect on people's narrative sense of how well their life has gone, but it's extremely important in their actual day-to-day experiences of their lives. Using the same data, and these are numbers that are not presented by the Princeton group, the correlation of global life satisfaction with the proportion of one's daily episodes spent with others is tiny, 0.002. The correlation of your sort of, so that's a correlation of global life satisfaction. If you look at the actual experiences people have day to day, those are 50 times more correlated with how much time they spend with others. So in conclusion, the idea I've tried to suggest is that there may be some limited but hopefully interesting parallel between the moment-by-moment measures and Dworkin's notion of focusing on the performance of life in our conception of living well, and hopefully fleshing those out a little bit with respect to income and sociability helps to deepen our understanding of different ways of thinking about living well. Thank you.